Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. This week, we are going to explore a topic that is very much in the news and in the national forefront. But our interest, of course, is also internal, intrapsychic, and psychological dynamics. And the topic, are you waiting to hear, is the wall. We have a government shutdown, and I have been interested in how the image of a wall and a government shutdown happens internally as well as externally. So, Lisa and Joseph, what's up for you about the wall? I know there's a lot up in this for me, literally, almost.
It sounds like we're going to try to add a dimension to the discussion that's more psychological and perhaps archetypal. So I'm drawn to just thinking about walls. And the image that comes to mind is just 2 years ago, I had an extended vacation in Ireland. And in the older parts of Ireland and in the countryside, there are walls, stone walls that are stacked by hand that have been restacked and maintained, creating, pastures and highly defined areas all over rural Ireland, which is strangely beautiful and very powerful and very defining. And when I think about that image and how ancient walls are, I think about the archetypal impulse to discriminate. And by that I mean discriminating between one thing and another thing, between what is mine and what is yours, who are my neighbors, who are my outsiders, and internal discriminations, which we need. For instance, relative to being a Jungian, discriminating what is authentic to me versus what the culture imposes upon me. And those kinds of differentiations all require some kind of a wall or an attitude that keeps things separate.
I'm thinking about the difference between that, a stone wall or a fence, and a wall that is like the wall that Trump proposes, huge, and a barrier that can't be surmounted, that can be a repressive, blockading kind of image.
A kind of wall of Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing about walls is that they're man-made, right? So that would sort of translate symbolically into, a structure that's associated with ego consciousness. So walls don't just spontaneously arise, right? They're built to some purpose. And and they do, I think, Joseph, kind of to your point, they are a structure. So again, thinking kind of intrapsychically, it's necessary to have some internal structure. And, there's some famous walls in history. You mentioned the walls of Jericho. There's also Hadrian's Wall, which my history is a little sketchy here, but I think that kind of differentiated Roman Britain from the
barbarians.
Barbarians, thank you. And of course the Great Wall of China, which was to kind of to protect and delineate a kingdom,
and also to fence out, wall out the barbarians.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
And that's what this wall on our southern border is intended to do, is to separate us from them. And there have been lots of us's and lots of them's in the course of history.
And that because walls are human artifices, that there has to be a vision or an understanding about what's going to be protected on the inside of the wall and what the threat is on the outside of the wall. And I think that's part of what we're trying to negotiate. For instance, do 100 Guatemalan children really constitute a barbaric horde, that requires the Great Wall of Jericho? So part of what we're also negotiating, I think, in the national psyche is what actually is the threat realistically and honestly, and what is an appropriate response to the threat. And that's part of what we're negotiating both internally and externally in our own psyches, evaluating our relationship to people who are different from us, difference in language, culture, socioeconomic status, and whether or not they truly pose a threat to us.
Versus what we project onto them, whoever the them is. We project oftentimes our own fears onto an other who is different.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to project our fears onto the unknown, don't we?
Yes, we do.
That which is unknown becomes frightening.
That which is unknown, the kind of nightmarish figures that sweep out of the dark and we feel unprotected. But we also defend against things which we know in a highly limited way. For instance, this archetype of the criminal, that if we do not understand our own antisocial impulses and understand them in a deep, familiar way, it's very easy to project that or to fantasize that it only resides in other people that are far away from me and thus highly dangerous. Part of what we project are things that we do know and don't like about ourselves or like about our culture.
And that touches into the idea of the shadow.
The shadow, some of which is not necessarily personally threatening. For instance, the way that we in our communities build up walls to isolate the wealthy and the poor. And just looking at that one dynamic of people who are in a lower socioeconomic status without attributing any other qualities to it, but the kind of wealthy enclaves that are created in America that are gated communities and also then create sometimes 10 or 20 feet of landscaped verge to make sure that even seeing the people who live outside the enclave is blocked, which perpetuates a kind of illusion that all the world is part of this upper scale fantasy, and that while people are inside the gated community or inside the wall, everything outside can be denied and put out of mind, including the suffering outside of the wall. And if we turn to the story of Gautama Buddha, that, as the mythopoetic story tells us, is that the Buddha's parents, the aging king and queen, had decided that they wanted to protect him from all forms of suffering, including aging and illness and poverty and death, kept him in this walled enclave. And finally, rather by accident, Buddha caught a glimpse of a sick and impoverished beggar and was shocked into this realization that the world is not all contained in this controlled enclave, but that desire to wall ourselves in against suffering. And Deb, you had mentioned in another podcast the idea of existential anxieties and uncertainties. I think that is also at the root of why people want the big wall, because much of what comes over our southern border are people that are carrying stories of trauma and suffering that, if they were to be brought into the culture, would have to be accepted and integrated and responded to. And in a psychological way, their suffering validated and shared. And that takes a lot of psychological strength and maturity, which perhaps we're not seeing a lot of in our current administration.
It's also a very great deal to take on. It's a big problem and a big implicit request that we truly acknowledge the terrible privations and trauma that many of the people seeking asylum here have suffered. It's a hard thing to welcome stories of privation, injustice, etc., rather than to stay in our own realm. Just like the parents of the Buddha tried to protect him from that knowledge. It's painful.
We want to wall ourselves off from it, don't we?
We want to wall ourselves in, and we want to wall the them out.
Just wanting to keep on walking around this in different ways, maybe thinking about it in terms of intrapsychically. So, in other words, I'm looking at a wall as a metaphor for that which perhaps separate our conscious personality from those things that are in the unconscious. And I think that it can be a mistake to have too few structures. And again, the fact that it's a wall, it works as an image because we're likely to develop these kinds of structures in the course of our development, right? We're not born with a discrete, delineated, conscious personality that's neatly separated and defended against the unconscious. This is something that grows up in the course of ego development. So if we don't have enough walls, that can look, like we're very loose and we're perhaps not even oriented to reality. I mean, I think possibly we could see psychosis as an example of an inadequate wall between consciousness and the unconscious. On the other hand, too rigid structures could also be a bad thing. And I've certainly seen that in my work as an analyst where someone has a very limited capacity to contact the unconscious because it's just too rigidly defended against. And, we could translate that metaphor out into the real world too. I mean, there are times when walls or other discriminating structures are needed and useful. And then it's possible to sort of overdo it too.
Well, I would say that if we think of the archetype of the wall as a defense, as a psychological defense, then it is an individual psyche's best response to a stimulus given its current state of maturity. We defend, we repress things, we project things, we sublimate, displace, the whole list of defense structures, because the ego in the given moment is failing to create a better relationship with what's going on or what threatens it. So, I mean, we can demonize the wall or wall making inside of us, but the only solution around the impulse to make a wall is for the ego to mature and to outgrow a need for it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's always some need for a wall, though.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying, is that we need walls when we need them.
Yeah.
And when we mature to a certain point, it becomes easier to let go of the wall because we no longer need to defend against what it is that we got anxious about.
Or, or the wall can become, like you were talking about, Joseph, a stone wall, which I think most of us find charming. There's a big difference between a stone wall and the Great Wall of China. And I've been thinking on and off of Robert Frost's poem, which he very astutely entitles Mending Wall. So is the wall something that is mending a relationship? Or what? There's an ambivalence there. But he says, before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out. And he also talks right at the beginning about something there is that doesn't love a wall. And he talks about the frozen ground heaving up the stone wall and boulders falling off the top of it. And I think where I'm going with this is that inherently kind of blurry line, because very few things are us and them or this and that, which goes to how do we relate to what's on the other side of the wall? And do we build a rigid barrier? Do we let everything merge into one thing? Do we mend our walls? Do we not need them? Is a wall just a separation between your field and mine that either one of us could step over at any time? Or is it an implacable, insurmountable barricade?
Well, I'd love to, if we're up for it, I'd like to just go through some of the classic ways that the ego defends. The ways that ego builds up walls internally and externally that were well described by the early psychoanalysts. And the list isn't that long, that we can build up or defend against something that frightens us by identifying with the aggressor who's threatening us. That if we focus on the feared traits of the other, we can conquer that fear by becoming more like them. Repression, which is one of the first defense mechanisms that Freud discovered, is where a certain information that's threatened to us is actually just locked up and stored away in the unconscious, and it drops out of memory, but is still energetically churning in the background. Projection is another kind of wall where people attribute their own thoughts and feelings to another person, and they deal with it as if it's an outside object. Displacement is a redirection of an impulse, usually onto a powerless substitute, so that a person or an object then becomes a symbolic substitute. So, for instance, if someone is feeling uncomfortable with their sexual desire for a real person, that they may then substitute a kind of fetish. Sublimation is another way of building a wall, where if something's very uncomfortable to us, we'll kind of redirect our efforts into something of a more constructive level, even an artistic kind of level. Denial is something that people all know about. That's another kind of wall, where if something's too much to handle, that they just refuse to experience it. And by the way, we see that on Facebook all the time. I'll see friends say, I am just going to drop out of Facebook for a couple of months because I am just not going to listen to any of this anymore. That there's a fantasy that they can just deny what's going on. Regression's another wall. When people become frightened, they become more childish or primitive. Rationalizing is a wall. Reaction formation is a wall, when people actually will then do the opposite of what they're actually feeling. So if somebody is feeling very angry towards a person, a reaction formation is when they would force themselves to actually behave in a loving way, to deny their actual feelings. So all of those are ways that have been kind of meticulously outlined relative to wall building internally and externally. And they're typical ways that human beings as a species reliably and repetitively use to build walls.
Yeah, so it's a way of they're all ways of avoiding the encounter.
Exactly.
And it's worth saying that defenses are necessary. I think both sort of psychologically, we all need defenses. I mean, we couldn't function if we didn't have proper defenses. And of course, in the sphere of international relations, we need to be able to defend ourselves, whatever that means. But the question is sort of how much and of what sort and all that kind of thing.
So I was wondering if we could take any one of these defenses and just unpack them for people, so we just don't have them hanging out there as a list.
Yes, I was the one that I really got my attention was the one about displacement. So that the anxiety provoking thing is displaced onto something that is manageable, something that I can tolerate. And I'm thinking of the wall, our external world proposed wall, as a huge effort at distraction or displacement. Because while the government shut down, and what might that mean internally if our own government were to shut down, we're not talking about rebuilding infrastructure or healthcare or education or the national debt. Everything is about the wall. So it feels like a kind of, and it happens in individuals, but it feels like an avoidance of the real problem. For example, somebody that's always so busy that he or she can't stop to think about, what am I really doing with my life? Am I avoiding the possibility of a career change, for example? Because that's really scary. I'd have to save up money and maybe go back to school or make a geographic move. So it's easier to just stay very, very busy with household chores and various other things.
Absolutely. And the classic example is, somebody has a hard day at work and then they come home and they scold their wives or they kick the dog or something like that because they don't feel like they have the power to argue directly with their authority figures. And then they feel they're going to vent their anger in other ways. And we kind of see that happening politically right now. For instance, people want to attack Mueller for his investigative prowess as a way of kind of kicking somebody who's just doing their job instead of going directly for the kind of big, powerful actors behind the scenes. So we're focusing on, firing the FBI director or the head of the Department of Justice. That's the dog that's going to get kicked because there's this kind of misdirected anxiety and aggression. And in fact, that happens sadly in all kinds of relationships. But that is a defense, actually, that when people displace their feelings onto a powerless substitute, there's a way in which they actually feel protected. And one of the things they're protected from is the strength of their own negative emotions and their own feeling of powerlessness.
So we might say the bigger and stronger the wall, the more powerless one feels.
The powerless one feels, and the more one is threatened by one's own internal experience. See, when we approach wall building from a purely psychoanalytic standpoint, people are defending against an internal experience which they will not tolerate consciously. And whether it's the feeling of aggression inside of them, or sexuality, or vulnerability, or more specifically being disenfranchised or alienated or less than, all this dimension of human feeling is cut away and walled off inside of the psyche. And then, of course, that's being projected out that, for instance, what these impoverished and destitute people are that are trying to cross the border, that they represent states of suffering that on a conscious level, most people don't want to experience. They don't want to encounter in themselves. And then consequently, they don't want to encounter people who represent those things.
That's really powerful. And what we defend against then ultimately in a way is ourselves and our access, paradoxically, to our own aliveness. If we could confront those feelings and relate to them and integrate them, as painful as those suffering aspects of ourselves, our shadows might be, it makes us bigger, it makes us more whole, and it makes us more alive.
Absolutely.
I want to sort of try to bring this into some Jungian terms here a little bit. First of all, as I think we've mentioned in a previous podcast, Jung was not in favor of, so to speak, tearing down all walls between consciousness and the unconscious. He really understood that we are all in danger, at least hypothetically, of being swamped by the unconscious, and that we must protect our little light, as he saw it once in a dream, of consciousness. So it is important to have some structure, as we've been talking about. But then I also want to kind of conversely introduce this idea of the ego-self axis, which is a term that refers to the access that the ego has to the deep unconscious, to what is sometimes called the guiding self. The thinking is that to be psychologically healthy, the ego has to be open to guidance from the interior. And so again, if our wall is too rigid or too high, we may lose that access to the self, the capital S. And that would be really tragic, because then we're not able to kind of correct course.
So there is something about a separation from the unconscious as our ego emerges developmentally. Infants have not yet developed an ego, but ego development is very important to all of us. And yet, if it becomes, if we think that's all that we are, we have in effect built a gigantic, rigid, insurmountable wall. So it seems like, I'm still going back to your experience in Ireland, Joseph, a stone wall is a nice image. It creates the separation, but it still allows some access. We can see over the wall. We can see into our neighbor's field. We can see into some of our own depths. It's not a roadblock. it's a discernment.
I'm also thinking about other images of walls in fairy tales or stories, and how sometimes walls can protect and surround something and allow a process to maybe a delicate process to kind of take hold in a protected environment. I'm thinking about there's a wall or a hedge in the story Briar Rose, or sometimes called Sleeping Beauty. And it certainly is this sort of massive defense that cannot be penetrated, but it sort of protects this process that just has to run its course. I think it's like 100 years or something. And then just, at the end of that, the wall is ready to be penetrated. Then the story, one of my favorite stories, The Secret Garden, that the secret garden is a walled garden in that story, if people remember. And it's a very kind of magical place because it's been sealed off from daily life for a while, and has been able to kind of wonderful things have been able to just sort of take hold of their own accord there.
So we could equate that with a kind of developmentally appropriate repression. That there are certain kinds of things that rise up in the psyche that have to be cordoned off and put away until the ego is strong enough, ready enough, is in the right place to take on that work consciously. And we see that with developmental tasks. And for Jung, that at midlife and further, that integrating all of these things that were put away and walled off in the psyche then becomes the integrative work of the second half of life and can be magical.
Right. I think particularly in terms of the story of The Secret Garden, it's almost like something's being protected from the demands of adaptation. So I think that's a little different than repression. It's almost like we may each of us have a fantasy life that we retreat to that can be very nourishing and life-giving and calming, perhaps. And it's where we go when we don't need to worry about filing our taxes or having the neighbors over for dinner or whatnot. But it's our secret walled garden, our secret garden, that we can wall off from ego demands, for example.
But we also, in the story, the two children tend the garden. There's an interaction, in other words, between the unconscious, maybe represented by this walled garden, and consciousness, as these two kids go out and garden and groom and prune and replant and all the rest of it to bring the garden back into more orderly shape and care. So I like that, the image of a walled garden, because it's both nature, which we might liken to the unconscious, and ego of what man can do, how man groups things in a way that is pleasing. I like that place where both things happen.
I would equate that with the idea of creative imagination, or the mundus imaginalis that Corbin writes about, that there is a state that people can get into where the imaginative world becomes profoundly alive and responsive and interactive with the ego, with the waking mind. And it is a place of magic and a place of exploring all kinds of possibilities, and is deeply private.
Yes, and I think perhaps what I'm suggesting is that to cultivate a space like that, we might need a wall.
Yeah, we need that privacy,
Right.
and may never even tell anybody that we go into this private imaginal garden where we sort things out and encounter our feelings and our wishes and are surprised by things that the unconscious sends to us. Jung kind of leaned into this in his writings about active imagination, which I think can have an overly therapeutic tone to it. But, as we know from the Red Book, this was a secret garden, so to speak, that he went to, and he had magnificent and poignant encounters in this imaginal worlds. And that he also created a wall. He was very private for him, even though that he wrote it down and created images. It was many, many, many years before it came into the public domain. He needed a wall around that.
But it was a wall he could traverse, and that is different from a barricade. To have a room or a garden, an imaginal space of one's own, is very different from a barrier that's impenetrable.
I think the image of a wall is related to the image of the tower. And the tower, of course, comes up in a lot of fairy tales, and Jung built a tower. So some kind of defense that also serves as a kind of crucible where something can cook or develop.
Yeah, there's a way in which energy and images need to gestate in a kind of uterine environment with a very special, rarefied conditions in order for it to grow. And I think we've all had that experience of maybe having a nascent idea or a fantasy and perhaps sharing it when it's very vulnerable or new and having somebody else comment on it either negatively or perhaps overly intrusively. And then it kind of squeezes the life out of it. And then we wind up not moving forward in our exploration of it. And so that's a fantasy that really needed the privacy of its own secret tower or secret garden.
No, I'm back from the internal world to the external world and how they can kind of mirror one another. That what is out there in the macro world has some correlates in our internal world. And I've been pondering what we do, where is our own infrastructure that might need to be mended, repaired, fortified, whatever. Our own healthcare issues that we need to take care of symbolically or emotionally or physically, and our own national debt. And how, if we're focused on something else, building a great big wall, we might not be paying attention to those, either in our national life or in our personal lives. And then the government shuts down. So, what? If I've been amused thinking about my government shutdown internally and what that might look like, but it is happening externally.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
So as we're sitting with all of this material in the container, the container of our conversation, I'm drawn to think about the sublimatio, or the sublimating function in the human soul. And Jung borrowed this term from alchemy. Now, the ancient alchemists, as they were experimenting with materials, were sometimes astounded that they could find a solid material, a little cube of some substance, put it in their alchemical vessel and heat it up, and it would not catch fire and it wouldn't melt into a liquid, but it would actually go directly into a vapor. And that was very magical and fascinating to them. And so psychologically, we're curious about this metaphor. So if we take the idea of a concrete physical wall stretching across the southern border of the United States, and we resist acting on that right away, but we kind of take it back and we put it into a psychological container, and we continue to reflect on it and resist the impulse to concretize it or act on it right away. One of the things that happens is culturally, we would start to feel some anxiety and frustration. But if we kept attending to the process, we might notice that a whole new direction, a whole new imagining can arise out of the same energy that's talking about the wall, that might allow us to reimagine a solution that would still meet the needs of the psyche and still meet the needs of our culture, but could look very innovative and different. So as we hold that here, I wonder what happens in our psyches as we put the wall in the alchemical vessel.
What I imagine the wall I have this literal image of it vaporizing into something and turning into a bridge. So it's a connecting, linking function. But bridges can have toll booths and, other rites of passage at either end, so it's not wide open. And I'm thinking of that lovely song about, we can build a bridge, in this case, between your world and mine. Don't you think it's time? Don't you think it's time?
I love that image because a bridge is still constructed. It's still made by decision and human action. It has to be engineered thoughtfully so that it can sustain the weight of objects and people traversing over it, and it still can be regulated. It's not a free for all, but it allows a movement of life from one side to the other.
And we could cross the bridge to the other side as well. It doesn't have to be one-way traffic. We could cross over and see what kinds of community building and more justice kinds of institutions might make it possible for people to live better lives in some of these countries and not be so desperate to flee.
Yeah, that we could imagine facilitating better conditions in South America, let's say, so that people didn't feel the need to flee. And we could spend some of our resources in that direction, which would still serve the same purpose of having Americans feel safe, because people to the South become neighbors instead of enemies.
What a shift in energy from walling people out and fear and condemnation to compassion and neighborliness.
And being open to transformation.
Yeah.
Transformation of our stance, transformation of the stance of people who are living differently than us. And that has to be a really conscious process. That's not likely to happen by accident.
Yeah. And they are our neighbors.
So as I'm listening into the political wrestling going on right now, one of the things that I hear is this strong stance of saying, we don't need to build a concrete wall, but let's take those funds and put them into a topic of, let's say, border security, and then open ourselves up to many different ways that could look like, instead of allowing it to just be this one simplistic and inflexible solution, but to allow it to be much more complicated and adaptive, because the problems are more complicated than that.
Yeah, which, by the way, one of the things I'm sitting with is, I think before this era of incredible polarization, like even maybe 6 years ago or even a little bit more, if you listen back to the way that policymakers talked about immigration, people on both sides of the aisle were much more conciliatory, and it was much easier to find this kind of complex common ground where a little of this is needed. Yes, we need to have better security, but we can also do this kind of thing. So it was more of a both and, so it strikes me that it's only been recently that things have gotten so kind of fixed in concrete and very, very polarized. And it wasn't so long ago that we were able to hold this complexity better as a country.
Yes, and fixed, simplistic solutions for very complicated problems never work. They've never worked historically, and they won't work now. And a fixed, regressive solution, like just build a wall, is actually something that child part of our psyches finds comforting. But when the adult part of our psyche returns to the scene and starts to chime in, we begin to realize that those very simplistic, childlike solutions are never sustainable, and they generally don't work well for us.
Well, I'm thinking that this might be a good place to stop and switch to a dream.
Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Today's dream is from a female dreamer. She is 35 years old, and she is a yoga instructor and in training to become a psychotherapist. And here's the dream. I'm in my parents' home and preparing to sleep when I feel scared, and I see through the window just shining eyes looking at me from the dark. I come closer and open the terrace door, and I see an old lady, and I start yelling at her and waving with my hands to make her go. I want to scream, but I have no voice, and then my partner wakes me up. I was lying in bed, feeling scared for a couple of minutes more. And she goes on to say, I am at this point considering having a baby. I want to be a mother. My partner has some reservations and has some kind of chronic health problems. And the main feelings in the dreamer says I felt very scared. Finally, a little bit of extra context. She says, the old lady reminded me for some reason of my grandmother who has passed away. I wasn't afraid of her, but it's her house, and she passed away 2 months ago.
Well, the first thing that comes up for me with this dream is really in line with what we've been talking about, that there's a wall, in effect, that she sees something, shining eyes looking at me from the dark, and doesn't approach, but starts yelling at her and waving to make her go away. Of that there's that divide between me and the other, that is kind of a corollary to what we've just been talking about.
Yes, she wants to shoo something away that's on the other side of the terrace door. She's afraid it's going to break through the door and somehow do something or engage her in a way that frightens her.
So I am aware that this is a very, very common type of dream to have, an intruder dream. And it, so someone's trying to get in, someone's, opening the window, or trying to lock the door. And I always think that in essence, it's an image of some part of our psyche coming toward us, trying to get our attention, and we feel threatened by it, and we're trying to keep it out. So this is perhaps the grandmother that's coming toward her, the great mother energy.
And the thing we're often defending against is that the image carries with it a new attitude or feelings which we don't feel prepared to integrate or would really demand a big change from us. If we think about it as the great mother, the grandmother, as she's considering having a baby, the great lineage of ancestors is in a sense knocking on her spiritual door, that the grandmother, the great-grandmother, her own mother, that the lineage of mothers is arriving and in a sense claiming her for that lineage. And in a sense, when the mother archetype activates in a woman's psyche, it changes how she thinks and feels and acts and behaves. And it is a change that has its own life. If that's not active at the moment, but is approaching the psyche, that's a sobering reality, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that she says that her partner has some reservations, because in my experience, as people approach parenthood, most of us are, I'm going to say nearly all of us, are incredibly ambivalent about it. And we may not be in touch with the ambivalence, but it's usually there. And possibly she's projected, like possibly in this partnership, her partner's holding the ambivalence, right? But it doesn't mean she doesn't have some also, it's just not conscious. And perhaps this dream is an expression of that, like warding off this experience of the great mother, if you will.
I'm aware that right at the outset of the dream, she is in her parents' home and preparing to sleep. So she's very much in the child position of one generation down from her parents. And then what she sees is the next generation up, an old lady. She doesn't say in the dream that she recognizes the old lady as her grandmother, but it's an old lady. And it's a huge transition to go from being a child, the sort of the maiden, and then a mother, and then a crone. That's what her life path portends.
And that even though on a conscious level, she writes that she wants to be a mother, or that her fantasy about what that would be like feels very positive to her, the realities of that just outside the window are huge and powerful. And anytime the ego meets something from the unconscious that is more powerful than itself, it shakes in its boots. It's a big accommodation that the ego in this glimpse might be realizing that she is not going to be totally in control of this process of motherhood. Even though she might decide to be a mother consciously, deciding to get pregnant feels like a thoughtful, ego-based decision. But once that pregnancy lands, there are ancient forces in your body and psyche that are just having their way with you.
I think it's interesting that she sees these eyes looking at her, so something's kind of beckoning, if you will. And then she comes closer and opens the door. So at first she's moving toward this, whatever it is. And it's only then that she starts yelling and waving her hands and trying to make it go away. So there again, coming back to that idea that there's an ambivalence, there's a moving toward it, and then maybe almost sort of sensing the larger reality here, then saying, oh gosh, maybe I'm not really ready for this. And she does say that the woman does remind her of her grandmother, even though she doesn't mention that in the text of the dream. That's in the later associations.
So would you, I'm thinking about what would happen if she were to imagine in waking life, kind of dreaming the dream on, and what would happen if she said something to the old lady in her dream? What would happen if, rather than banishing her,
and engaged her?
Exactly, she engaged her and heard what the old lady has to say.
I think that would be exactly the way to go. To really see what's being asked of her and what she might ask of the old woman.
And it is, I think it is promising, kind of prognostically, that she does come closer and open the door, right? There's that wall that's not too much of a barricade. She can approach what's in the unconscious and even open the door to it. And so it does seem like there's a possibility maybe to have a conversation with that part of the psyche.
I'd like to add just another dimension to it, that for Jung, often the old woman and the old man were also symbols of the self, which transcends even the idea of the mother, but is more dynamic than that. That even though it may be unfamiliar to her in her current religious outlook, but the goddess, the divine, can come to us in the form of the old woman whose eyes shine in the dark. And the magnitude of a spiritual encounter like that can be very frightening.
Yeah, because she is coming from the beyond, right? I mean, the dreamer tells us that her grandmother passed away a couple of months ago. This is certainly an encounter with something transpersonal.
It feels like we may have coasted into a place where we are finished for this week.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.